the director of the Kerwin Center. I think I know many of you on the line, but we're really, really pleased to be able to sponsor, support, deliver, however you want to put it, this two-part series on selecting effective assessment technologies, which is being facilitated today by Jennifer Harrison and Sherry Braxton, both from UMBC. I'll let the two of them introduce themselves in a little more detail as they get started. But this really kind of stemmed out of the assessment convening that we did back in spring of 2017, which at Bowie State University, which was, I think, a really, really successful event. We had lots of folks there. And one of the sessions that I had the privilege of being part of, I think I was moderator on that, was this session with Jennifer and Sherry and a couple of others from Bowie and elsewhere, talking about the kinds of things that we can do to facilitate this very important activity on our campuses. Unfortunately, assessment tends to get kind of short shrift, and as has been suggested in the description of this session, the more we can provide technologies that can smooth the path and make doing assessment easier, I think the better off we all are at our institutions. So I won't spend any more of Jennifer and Sherry's time talking to you about that part of it, but I think you're in for a treat. It looks like it's going to be a very interactive session. And before we kick it over to Jennifer and Sherry, Fiona, did you have a couple of kind of logistical things that you wanted to address?
I do. Thanks, MJ. So a couple of things to note. Today's webinar is being recorded, and both the recording link and the PowerPoint will be shared with everyone after today's session. Currently, everyone's line is muted. However, during certain points of this webinar, we will have teams report out. So during these points, we will unmute everyone's line, but please make sure that your phone line is always muted, and so we don't get any feedback while others are talking. So just mute and unmute yourself during the points when we are reporting out. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A chat window to send your questions and comments, and we will get to them throughout the webinar as well as during the Q&A portion of this session. Now I wanted to go and turn this over to get the webinar started.
Great, well, welcome to Selecting Effective Assessment Technologies. This is the first part of our two-part webinar series. I'm Jennifer Harrison, and I am the Associate Director for Assessment in UMBC's Faculty Development Center.
Hi, and I'm Sherry Braxton. I'm the Senior Director of Instructional Technology.
So what we're working on today is looking at ways to use assessment technology so that we can take outcomes to scale. We want to be able to roll up learning data up to the institutional and program level so that we can use our data more effectively to improve student learning. So we started by analyzing your responses to our little survey and registration form in terms of what is your role, because we want to build a little common ground. So what we learned from what you included in your registration form is that we have majority faculty, and we have some assessment coordinators, administrators, and others. So it's a range of people with us together today to talk about assessment technologies. And what we're working to do is to address some specific learning outcomes. So we are going to present to you a taxonomy that classifies technology tools. We're going to lay out a planning process and encourage you to customize it to your institutional culture. And we're going to develop criteria to evaluate technologies for specific uses. What we've done, though, to lay it out for you as clearly as possible is we provided a curriculum map. If you're interested in curriculum mapping, you can go to the UMBC Faculty Development Center website and download our templates and tools. This one is an example of our graduate map, because you can see that our outcomes are particularly challenging. And we lay out what we're going to be doing today with our opening, where we did one brief opening question. We have handouts for you, so if you haven't downloaded and printed the handouts, we encourage you to do that. Sherry has also posted for you the article that we wrote for the NILOA, National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment occasional paper. Our taxonomy is going to help you to go through the different technologies and also think about the ways that we use assessment technology or the ways that we need to use it. We're going to lay out our planning process. Our midterm is going to be some activities, so you'll need those worksheets that we emailed to you earlier. Then we're going to look at our rubric, and then we're going to wrap up with our minute paper. So that's our plan for today's session. And what we're hoping for you to do is to do the work. When we get to the worksheets, we're going to ask you to do those worksheets and then report out. So we will be able to give you the opportunity to share.
We should also say, I believe Fiona is recording this, and we will provide the slides afterwards.
Great. So we want to get started with a Think, Pair, Share. What we'd like you to do is use the minute paper that you have in your packet of materials and take a couple of minutes to think about the similarities and differences between student learning outcomes assessment and institutional effectiveness and student success. Think about the kinds of evidence they require and how we handle and manage those types of data. So think about it for just a moment. Use your worksheet to write down a few ideas, and then collaborate with someone near you, with your team, someone in your team, and discuss. And then we're going to ask you to share those ideas with us.
Okay, so now while you're wrapping up your individual thoughts about student learning outcomes assessment and institutional effectiveness and student success, start collaborating with someone in your room or someone who's near you. If you're remote and you see somebody in your institution is also online, you can set up a private chat with them and exchange some ideas. And we'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together.
And we have a few people here in our live audience, and they're going to be collaborating as well.
If you're just joining us, we're doing a Think, Pair, Share on the topic on the screen. We're going to give you 1 more minute, and then we're going to come back together.
Just gonna come over.
Okay, so we're going to start our sharing, and actually our participants here in the room at UMBC are willing to share out, so if you'll just introduce yourself and what your role is.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bass, and I'm a lecturer here at UMBC. And so I have another colleague here, and we talked about the assessments and evidence. And so one of the things we discussed as far as student learning outcomes, almost at like the class level, you know, using exams and final exams, and the evidence that we use. So those are our assessment techniques, and the evidence that we use about students achieving their outcomes are we map the learning objectives that we've given our students to each of our exam questions. And that gives us clear evidence about which specific learning, learning outcomes students are achieving, and where we can kind of help them from there. But when you contrast that with institutional effectiveness and student success, the evidence they use is a pass rate as one example for students achieving what student success is. And then the other point that we talked about is in the class, we're able to really do these assessments on an individual basis, whereas the university is really looking at a more group, at a group level with multiple, much larger amounts of students. So those are the things we discussed.
All right, well, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate that, because you got really to the heart of the issue here, which is the institution gathers specific data like pass rates, DFW rates, or ABC rates if you prefer the catapult method. And at the class level, we're actually gathering data from rubrics and exams that are mapped back to the course level outcomes. So what Sherry and I are going to talk about as we move forward with our presentation is we're going to talk about ways to map that course level data to the institutional and program level so that we can pull it up and create bridges between the institutional level data and the course level data, and use it to aggregate and disaggregate and really dig into student learning in a more effective way.
Do we have another group that would like to?
Hi, everybody. Your lines are unmuted. We do ask that everybody go and make sure that you have it muted on your end, but please feel free to go and report out and share.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Anybody have anything they want to share? Okay.
Hearing none, we'll go ahead and continue and ask Jennifer to remove the lines, please.
Here at UMBC and really isolating the key issues here. And we appreciate that, Sarah. And she didn't have any coaching at all on answering those questions. So we're going to move on to address our key terms and then lay out some of our ideas so that we can get to the exciting part of doing some of the work together and preparing for our follow-up session where we will ask each of you to come back and report what you are doing. So let's talk about some of our key terms. Well, first off, outcomes. And Sarah already highlighted that when she shared from her Think, Pair, Share. But outcomes are central to student learning assessment. They set the goals for students in what they're supposed to learn at the course level, the program level, and the institutional level. And we're going to dig into how outcomes connect and relate to each other as we move forward with our presentation.
Great, and we want to make sure everybody's clear on what we mean by analytics. Analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of student-acquired knowledge. So when we're looking at specifically learning analytics in our discussion today, but it encompasses that entire process of measuring, collecting, analyzing, and reporting.
Right, and as we talked about before, analytics really is at that institutional level, that institutional effectiveness level, and so we need what's called alignment. We need particularly vertical alignment so we can take the actual places where students are learning at the course level and pull that data up to the program and institutional level so that we can really understand what it is that students are achieving in the classroom and use that to dig into the analytics data that we gather at the institutional level.
And we heard a little bit earlier about direct learning data, those assignments that you do in class, whether it's a paper, a homework, a quiz, and also the data that you gather from rubrics. So that's what we mean by direct learning data.
Right, and as Sarah highlighted for us, when you're giving exams, for example, in chemistry like she teaches, you want to map your test questions to the course level outcomes, and that's very important because, as we know, grades are indirect learning data because they don't really allow us to drill down into what it is that students are learning. So analytics, like anything from clickstream data to retention data,
Right.
to completion data,
Your
to
LMS
DFW,
data.
all those types of things are indirect learning data because they give us insight and understanding about how students are learning, but they don't look directly at student learning. So we argue that you need both direct and indirect learning data to really get a clear understanding of how well students are learning.
Yeah, and finally, taxonomy, it's a way to classify related objects. So there's some sorts of characteristics that allow you to identify what their similarities and differences are. And we're going to use the taxonomy today to talk about the different assessment management tools that are out there.
So we want to really share with you the ideas about why this is important. In case you aren't aware, what we're really trying to do as an institution is demonstrate that we're achieving our mission. We want to demonstrate that we're achieving our mission, our vision, and our institutional level learning outcomes. To be able to do that effectively, we need learning outcomes data and we need learning analytics data. So what we're talking about today is a way to use assessment technology so we can make learning outcomes data actually usable at the institutional and program levels so that we can effectively demonstrate the mission. Colleges and universities have to prove that they're achieving their mission to many different audiences, and so we're all juggling technologies that capture and use data and demonstrate success in meeting these goals. And so with these multiple data sources, we need to have ways to bring those sources together, integrate them, and triangulate them so that we have a deeper, richer understanding of where students are learning and where we could offer additional support mechanisms to support them. And as we've learned from the NILOA Provost survey that came out earlier this year, meaningful implementation in these areas remain elusive, and we really need to move forward with it. So triangulation of student learning outcome data and student success data is at the core of our discussion. As you can see, what's emerging on the screen now is our diagram of current technologies and technologies that we anticipate to grow in the future, working together to connect both direct measures and indirect measures so that we can understand how well students are learning. And the diagram that you're looking at now highlights some of the key tools that many of us are already using, and we will ask you more questions about these as we move on. Almost all of our USM institutions have student information systems. Many of them have learning management systems. There are various assessment management systems out there as well, and if at UMBC we have a data warehouse where we collect all of those things and then we use data analysis tools to analyze that data and pull it out. And where we're really struggling is in pulling the direct evidence out from the classroom level and the classroom interactions from our faculty and pulling that up to the institutional level.
Okay, so we're going to start the discussion around the taxonomy and looking at assessment management tools and systems that are currently being used. NILOA has a document, and if you go to the link that I think either Fiona or Nancy provided that goes to our occasional paper, one of the supplemental documents they provide is the NILOA paper on assessment management systems. It's just a list of different assessment management systems and some of their features. But what we found in looking at these tools is that they have different functions, and so there's not one tool that will solve all the problems you need with regard to assessment. So what we're going to ask you to do right now, you have a worksheet, and it will allow you to fill in some of this information. What tools, systems, and or technologies do you use? And what functions do they perform? And the worksheet looks something like this. You may have a few more blanks on it, but we want you to take a few moments. Some of you did this in your responses to the registration, so you have some ideas already. But I know there are a number of institutions that have multiple people here, and different ones of you are aware of different systems. So the idea now is to, if you're in the same room with each other, try to capture all of those here with regard to the tool name and what functions they provide. So we're going to give you a few minutes to work on this within your groups, and we'll call you back. So I'm going to put that back up. We'll give you just one more minute on this exercise.
For us if we
So I
need
know
to,
some
right?
people don't like to speak over the webinar, so I'm going to ask you if you have a tool and you want to describe what function it provides, you go ahead and share it in the chat window. We can take your inputs and your feedback that way if you don't have the ability to get on mic and share. If you do have the ability to get on mic and share and you're interested, we're going to open that up in just a minute so that you can share what tools and systems or technologies you're using for assessment and what functions they're currently performing for you. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start sharing here. So who would like to go first and identify one tool that you're using to support assessment? Okay, so we've got someone saying they use ELMS, which is their Canvas instance, and the speed grader function to assess learning outcomes. So a little mini Family Feud here. I think I heard you say that you use a tool that provides collecting. Oh, boy. Collecting. So one type of assessment tool is one that collects assessment data and lets you build and apply rubrics, tests, course level grading, student evaluation, and link to student outcomes. That's a great one. Does anyone have another they'd like to share? Yes, if you'd like to speak during the share, just unmute your line and you can share with everyone. So we have our studio audience in the room. If we don't have someone who wants to share on the chat, what would you like to share?
All right, so one of the things that we use in our class that I mentioned previously are learning objectives. And so I think we use our learning objectives to help close the loop on some topics.
How about that? So closing the loop. That would be one of the essential functions of an assessment management system. We've got another comment here. We use Blackboard tools for classroom learning outcomes assessment in TK20 for competency rubrics, aggregating and reporting data. Well, that sounds like something you might use for connecting. That's an important function. Don't show this message again. That's an important function of assessment management systems. They support the linking and aligning of outcomes both horizontally and vertically. The creation and generation of curriculum maps and allowing you to link both information from your student information and learning management systems. So that's another great one.
And as we've shared this at various presentations, we found people saying connecting is really one of the hardest things, connecting and closing the loop. So you already got the two hardest answers. Let's see if you can get the other one.
Well, here's another one that came in through the chat. Kim says we use Excel, SPSS for analysis and TaskStream for reporting and analysis. You've knocked out two, so I'm going to give you a double whammy here with analyzing, which supports statistical examination, as you said, and enables manipulation of data and evidence. But I'm going to give you a bonus one for also communicating. Right. That's another key capability of assessment management systems that allows you to generate reports and progress toward an institution's mission, goals, and priorities.
Right, and it would be great in communicating if we could have a dashboard that showed us how well students were learning across the institution and at various programs.
Right, so we have Melanie indicating we have individual instructors collect specific assignments and use standardized rubrics to create standardized reports, which are then collated into reports that are shared. And so that is a great example of organizing.
Right, because you have to organize all of that data to be able to use it effectively.
Right, supporting data management and collecting, tracking of program, course, and curricular assessment information. We've got one last one to turn over, and you kind of touched on it. Sometimes we need to keep records of things, and so we need to, I'm just going to turn this one over.
All right, turn it over, Sherry.
Archiving. So we need to store assessment evidence in a long-term repository so that we can have those artifacts for for short-term analysis and long-term analysis.
Right, and it just further documents that you're achieving your mission when you can point to student artifacts and demonstrate their learning.
Great, so those are the 7 categories of our taxonomy. The taxonomy is provided in the paper. Oh, there's the clapping. And here's a recap of those functions. All right.
So these are the key terms for our taxonomy. And next, we're going to look at how this works at UMBC.
So before we get there, what we want to show you, and this is in the paper, again, that paper that NILOA provides that has a list of assessment management tools, first of all, we want to just make sure it's clear to you that that is not an extensive list. This is just an example of some systems that we're familiar with and that we've had some experience with. And we're able to look at these systems with regard to those taxonomy categories that we just explained and defined for you. So just so you're clear, the rows are the systems, the columns are the taxonomy categories, and if you see a star in an intersection of the row and column, that means that it provides at least one of those capabilities of that category. And again, you can see the extensive explanation of the categories in the paper. If there's an X, that means it provides all of the capabilities that we've defined for that category. So to our point, and what we've been saying all along, is there's no one solution that solves all the problems that we have out there. So it requires multiple systems on our institutions to gather this information, and then to try to connect it, as Jennifer mentioned. That's the huge problem when you have systems that don't talk to each other and they're siloed.
Right. And then what's really interesting for us is, since our occasional paper came out just this week, we're already getting pushback from vendors. For example, APHIS, for example, which hits at least all of the categories on the taxonomy, they're not satisfied with their stars. They want to be, everybody wants to be all X's, but our analysis reveals that no one achieves all X's. In other words, none of them provide all the capabilities of any one of the categories.
So we hope some of this work ends up resulting from our vendors looking at what we really need and making the adjustments to their functionality.
Right, because most of them really need to adjust to the idea of authentic assessment, not secondary evaluation assessment or any of the old ideas in assessment. We want them to help us to put together and collect and connect the data for authentic assessment.
Yes. So well stated, Jennifer. Jennifer and I should do like our own talk show at this point, because we've done this presentation a few times, so we've got a nice flow going here. So what does this look like at UMBC? Well, here are a number of the systems that, and again, this is not the extensive list of systems at UMBC, but what we've done is shown you some of the tools that are used on campus and the areas that they cover in our taxonomy. And again, we have systems that provide some of the capabilities. We wish that they could talk to each other to give us that full capability of analysis and insights that Jennifer was speaking of earlier.
Right. So if you look down for example, look down the connecting column, you can see that there's some gaps there, because we really have some trouble getting the systems to talk to each other. And when we speak about this, there's always the option to go to the CSV file and connect that way. But we know that most folks don't have time for that, and we want systems that are going to connect and talk to each other more effectively without doing a whole lot of busy work of cutting and pasting and massaging and trying to get it to work. We just want them to connect and work.
Right. So what I provided you in the chat was a link to a page at UMBC that shows our data warehouse structure. You should have that up on, if you guys want on the chat, but basically I took them to the UMBC page that shows Rex, which the diagram you see indicates the different types of systems that we have on campus: our analysis systems, our reporting systems, our data sources, and the interventions and systems that track interventions. And that box in the center represents our data warehouse, Rex, which is the report exchanging capability that we have. It's our data warehouse. It has multiple data sources, and it allows us to generate reports and to connect data that are related to students, finance data, HR data, and our LMS data, and to then make decisions that are based on data and not just what we think is happening, right?
Right, and in case you're wondering, REX stands for Report Exchange, but it also stands for our mascot.
Right. So what's great about REX is that it has some candor guided reports. They're pre-defined reports that faculty, staff, and administrators can use to make their decisions. But then we also have the ability for users to generate their own reports, and that requires some training, but it is available. And we also have some institutional research, analysis, and decision support for reports. So it's a pretty strong thing to have a central warehouse where you can at least pull data in to and extract. Now, not all of our systems currently feed into REX, but that is something we're working on, getting the student success data in REX so that we'll be able to see both curricular and co-curricular impact on student success. So this diagram, and actually I'm going to share another paper with you. It's co-authored by our CIO, Jack Seuss, and the CIO from Arizona University. I think he's Arizona, not Arizona State, from what I recall.
It's University of Arizona.
University of Arizona, thank you. I never get that right. Jennifer always has to correct me. But within that document, you'll see an illustration of the UMBC's IT systems that are in place to support student success, and that's what you see here. And on that lower level, you'll see our basic ERP systems, right? Finance, HR, and our student information system. From there, you'll see our LMS and our SaaS applications. So all of these things then connect into level 3, which is our business intelligence system, and that is the representation of Rex, where we integrate that data. And level 4 shows the student success initiatives that we have in place. It includes our early alert system, measurement and activity tracking tools, predictive analytics, and things of that nature. And we're using a number of tools like Civitas Learning and EAB Academic Performance. Again, Jack talks about that in the paper if you want to read about that. And then at the top level is kind of where we're going. That's the goal, to have these dashboards. All of these things are in development so that the data that's on those lower levels can then be used to support the institutional mission of improving student success.
Right, and so some of level 5 is aspirational,
Yes.
and we're hoping that you'll be thinking about that too. How can we take this to that upper level so that we can see the data, use the data, connect it to our advising systems, and to actual use in the classroom?
Yes.
So here you see the UMBC assessment plan. And we're going to look at this again, but really the goal here is for you to be thinking about where does the data, where did the data come? So if you look down here at the bottom, these are the different data sources, and we want that data to flow all the way up to the provost. So what we're laying out for you are some ideas about ways to do that. And when we move into the process section of our presentation, we'll dig into that a little bit more. But we want to collect authentic evidence from multiple sources and then bring it up to the provost level and then be able to slice and dice that data in various places throughout in the middle section of the plan.
Okay. So you had an exercise in Worksheet A to just identify the tools and the functions they were providing. We'd like for your team to now take a little bit of time to do what we did on the UMBC sheet, which is, again, list those tools and then identify, based on those definitions, what functions those tools are providing to you. And if you feel like you have a tool that's not giving you everything you'd like in one of those categories, you might want to use the same notation we did, a star to say that it captures or provides some of those capabilities, or the X that says we get everything we need out of this tool currently. So we're going to give you a few moments to work on that, and we'll come back together.
So it's the one that Fiona.
Yes, Fiona sent you a document that has the definitions of the taxonomy categories. So pull that out as you're doing this exercise. And Fiona has also provided a link to the worksheets in the chat if you joined late or did not have a chance to print those out. Okay, we're going to finish this up in just a moment. So wrap up your discussions, and then we'll start a little bit of sharing a report out of perhaps a tool that we didn't talk about in Worksheet A that you have identified that provides some of these functions. And Fiona has just provided another link in the chat if you came late to the handout, and that handout also provides the definitions for the taxonomy. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do some sharing on this. If you feel like you'd like to share in the chat, feel free. If you'd like to come to your mic, feel free to do that as well. But we're going to call on the people in our room are thinking, boy, I should have just stayed in my office and participated remotely. We're going to ask the people in the room to share a tool that perhaps we did not have listed in our example of tools from UMBC.
Okay, I'll admit I'm having second thoughts. I wish I had stayed in my office.
But we appreciate you sharing, Sarah. This is Sarah Bass again from chemistry.
Yeah, no, I'm having a great time actually. I have colleagues here, just the spokesperson. And so one of the systems that we use in our course, we have one of the largest courses here at UMBC, but we use a system called ALEX. And I think ALEX hits on three major functions: collecting, organizing, and analyzing data. But this is very much on assignment by assignment basis, but it also produces cumulative reports that help us assess whether students are forgetting any information, and then helps support us in making sure we meet objectives before their exams if we notice that there are particular topics, etc., that are falling out. So.
Oh, great. So it sounds like you use ALEX and you map it back to your course learning outcomes. And there was another term you used when we had the speaker on mute and we were talking. And you remember what that term was?
No.
ALEX?
Oh, it's an adaptive learning.
Yeah, so it's adaptive release, right?
Yep.
So if you're familiar with adaptive release, then you probably already know that it gives students questions, and if they're able to answer those questions, it gives them harder questions along those lines. But if they're not able to answer, it helps them to review and build that knowledge up. So it's a really great tool for helping students build their learning, and at the same time, it collects that data for the professor and for the institution.
Great. Does anyone else want to share something in the chat or come on mic? They're all shy today, Jennifer.
Apparently, well, they're going to have to share with us next week.
Yes,
because next week,
don't run away. You can be high today, but next week you're going to be put on the spot. So take the time to digest this week and figure out what's going on. And next week we hope to hear from you with regard to what your taxonomy looks like right now. This will ask you to complete this worksheet and bring it back to the workshop next week.
and then that'll benefit everyone in the system so that we can see what tools are out there, what kinds of expertises are we building at various institutions so that we can learn from each other and really build a more effective system.
Right, and really we want to also see where there's commonality in the tool sets, because we may be using a tool in a certain way that may benefit another school or vice versa, and just seeing if there's commonality in the tool set, why are we all doing separate purchasing licenses when maybe we could take advantage of the system purchasing power. Or maybe it's just we've got a tool that you might be interested in piloting because you found that it has a few more capabilities than the one you currently have.
Right, and I want to remind everybody that one of the key questions at the USM symposium in April, I think it was 2017, one of the key questions during the plenary discussion was how do we take all of these data and lift them up to the system level?
Right.
How can we compare and contrast across system institutions and really support each other in our efforts to improve student learning and success.
Right, and one of the things I'm going to just reiterate from the paper that I shared, the Modeling and IT Strategy for Student Success. In the beginning of that paper, it has a table that talks about student success stakeholders and their key issues. And this is another thing we would want to look at from a system perspective. And one of the things Jennifer and I are working on is use cases. You know, what kind of things do we think everyone really wants to know about their data? So I would ask you to also look at those student success stakeholders and key issues and keep those in mind as we continue the discussion and go forward into next week's discussion.
Oh, great. Well, that's a nice setup for our next step,
Yes.
Sherry, because we are going to be looking at stakeholders, because what we're going to look at next is how to plan for assessment technologies. So when we started in January, taking these ideas out to various conferences and so forth, we really, when we dug into planning assessment technologies, we got back some really fabulous feedback, because what we realized, and other folks were realizing, is that without a plan for how your data fit together and how they connect, you really can't use assessment technologies very effectively. So when we went to EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative, the vendors who came and spoke with us said, oh yes, if you could just train the institutions for how to pull that data up. So we spent a lot of time on developing this section for you. I'm going to give you a preview, and then I'm going to walk through some of the basics. So the first step is to clarify common ground. We're going to encourage you to use backward design and then take inventory. And I will go into each of these in more detail in a moment. Next, we want to identify audiences, who's going to need to use the technology or the data. And then once you synthesize these steps, you're going to want to think about where you can find expert advice on your campus to identify potential solutions. And then finally, you're going to want to form a collaborative team of people from all over the institution who can come together to evaluate and pilot these solutions and see if they really work in all the different spaces where you need them to work. So I'm going to dig into these in a little bit more detail. So starting off with clarifying common ground. What you're really asking yourself is, how do your institution's outcomes align at each level? So assessment technology can help your institution to organize and connect your outcomes and results, but first you really need to clarify common ground at each outcome level. So this is where you need vertical and horizontal alignment so that you can document that common ground. And these are things that you can ask us about in more detail later, and if you go to curriculum mapping workshops, you can learn more about that. But this is really at the heart of assessment technology planning. And if you look at your institutional assessment plan, you can get you'll see a diagram of how data is supposed to flow at your institution. And here's the diagram. We looked at this a minute ago. This is a diagram from UMBC's assessment plan, and it demonstrates how information flows. We need to collect authentic evidence from multiple sources. So that's what the red brackets indicate. The various sources from general education, from specific programs, from the surveys that we take, and data from the administrative units. But we also need to analyze them at multiple levels. So we're going to need to analyze this data both at the mid-level and then at the provost level. So the provost needs to collect and connect all of these data. And that's why we need to clearly establish the common ground. So if we want multiple audiences to use these data in multiple ways to improve student learning, then we need flexible and probably multiple tools to help us to do this. So let's look at this another way. So this is a diagram of how we clarify common ground at UMBC. So we start with the UMBC mission, and then we align to the institutional level, and then at UMBC's case, also our general education outcomes. And then we go down to the program level and the course level. And the arrows in the middle really indicate that vertical alignment from the mission on down to the course level outcomes, but also that horizontal alignment going from the general education program to the program level, because we know our students are learning holistically across the institution, and we really want to understand how that works. So again, what we really know is that learning starts with that actual demonstration of learning. So this is a map from one of our faculty members here on campus where she has the students do a service learning project. She maps that project up to her course learning outcomes. She maps those to her program level outcomes, and then they map to our institutional level outcomes and the mission. So this, you can see a diagram of vertical alignment, and this is the kind of work that we need to be able to do to create that connecting. In other words, if we want to take data from the course level and roll it all the way up to the mission and demonstrate how well the institution is doing as a whole, then we need to have these relationships clearly mapped.
And this is why we continually stress that we'd like for faculty to use our LMS, because we have to capture that learning data in order to be able to do this work.
Right, and that's a really great point, Sherry, because what we've done in this particular class measures a service learning project using a rubric. The rubric, each row of the rubric is mapped in Blackboard using also EAC visual data to help us out. So each one of those outcomes is in Blackboard, and we map it on up so we can pull it out. And if we have more faculty members mapping these data and connecting them, then we're going to be able to gather more direct evidence and roll it up to the institution. However, we do point out that this alignment can be complicated. And this is an example from Media and Communication Studies here, where we have a Facebook rubric that's mapped up to the Media and Communication Studies 101 outcomes, and then to the program outcomes, to the institutional level outcomes, and then back to the mission. So it's not always a direct line, and in many cases we'll have one assignment might be reaching out to meet multiple outcomes, and they may map up in different ways. So alignment can be complicated, but it's well worth it for you to spend some time thinking about how does the learning that is happening at the classroom level map back up to the institutional level. And if you're doing academic program reviews, you are really, in your program, you're really answering this question when you answer the question about how does your program serve the mission of the institution. And now you can see on the screen is our vertical alignment worksheet, which we provided to you in your packet of handouts. And we also have this on the Faculty Development Center website, customized for UMBC faculty and staff to use. And this is just a worksheet that when we meet with faculty and we talk with them about their measurement tools and their outcomes, we use it as a way to sort of help them map all the way back up to the mission. So, I mean, what's really working here is you're asking, what did you want students to learn and be able to do in the assignment? How does that help the students to fulfill the course outcomes? How does that help the students to fulfill the program outcomes, the institutional level outcomes, and how does it contribute to the mission? So if you imagine this as multiple data points across multiple courses, we want to be able to flow this data up and get a cross-institutional view about how well students are doing. So this particular worksheet is in your packets. We want to give you a few minutes to look at it, and we're going to challenge you to dig into using this as you take some time between this session and the session next week.
And in the chat, I've shared the link to the Faculty Development Center's learning assessment resources, which Jennifer just referenced.
Right, and you'll find on there all kinds of worksheets, some of them in Excel, some of them in Word, that you can download and use to think through this. And now on the screen, you see the way we've customized it to UMBC, with UMBC mission at the top, and then our functional competencies, which are our general education learning outcomes, but they're also our institutional level outcomes. So we ask each of our programs to map their program level outcomes, or PLOs, to those institutional level outcomes. And then the course level outcomes should map to the program, and then the actual rubric row or the test questions, like Sarah Bass had told us about earlier, when she writes her exams for chemistry, she maps those questions to the student learning outcomes, so that when she looks at the data, she can parse out all the different pieces and understand how well students are learning or not learning. And then if they're demonstrating that they're not getting a particular learning outcome, she can dig back into that data and offer them additional learning opportunities and help them achieve those goals. So this is the idea of building common ground. Next up is using backward design. And we really got this idea from Linda Hodges, the director of the Faculty Development Center, when she talks about backward design in terms of course design. She asked faculty the question, what is it you want students to know and be able to do several years after they've taken your class? So we thought this was a great way to think about the data. And we started a lot of our data discussions here at UMBC by looking at data pulled out of other institutions, so we could get folks to understand what it is that we're looking for in terms of the evidence. So what direct evidence do you need to understand student learning outcomes? What is it your audiences are expecting? What kinds of data will be useful? And how do these data need to connect to each other and to other types of data? So backward design really helps you to think about how to map your courses back from what you want students to know and do. And we thought this was a useful way to think about the data. So we'll provide you with an example of some data so that you can take a look at one example. This one is aggregated rubric data from 5 writing intensive courses where students were struggling to write APA papers. This we actually mapped in Blackboard, and we're actually able to connect and pull the data out in some limited ways. And faculty hypothesized that students were struggling to integrate the skills needed for an APA research paper, so they created a shared rubric, and then they began to gather data. And this is one of the first examples from fall of 2015, but this project is ongoing, and we have data for multiple years now. Faculty also aggregate data in other ways, and this is a chart that appeared in our Middle States self-study. And this comes from Media and Communication Studies, really much like that map that I shared with you earlier, where we looked at the vertical alignment. And here we're looking at how well did students learn across an entire semester doing repeated assignments. And the data demonstrated that this particular repeated assignment that students did every week helps students to improve their information literacy skills. So when you're thinking about backward design in terms of data, you want to ask the question of what kinds of data do you need? And then think about how are you going to need to aggregate it, and that involves connecting and creating relationships. What reports do external reviewers require? So that's touching on MHEC and Middle States and the system and other places where we need to present the results of student learning. We want to think about the reports that our institutional assessment process requires. Here at UMBC, we do biennial reports and academic program reviews, where most of these materials are shared with the Council of Deans. And then we want to think about how your institution shares learning results. And this is probably one of the big areas where we notice a gap in sharing data, and that's something that you want to be thinking about. How do you share your outcomes and the results on your websites and in various other places? The next step in the process is thinking about how you take inventory. And we want to encourage you to think about what's already happening on your campus. Before you start adding in new things, we encourage you to take inventory. Ask the question of your colleagues about the processes and technology tools that are already in place. When Sherry and I started this process, we were delighted to discover tools in various places that we didn't really know about. And since Sherry's in charge of supporting all those technologies, it was very helpful for her to find out about them so she could support those. Like Acrobatique was a new one that we just recently added. So your institution might already be using a host of technologies, and this will give you access to on-campus experts who've already tested the tools available.
The other thing is it may get you talking across your institution so you don't have systems that are being used in siloed ways. There are often colleges and schools within the institution will adopt tools, say, for ePortfolio, but they may be the only ones using it, while others on campus may benefit from it. So it's to get you out of silos and really find out what tools are being used across campus. Are they being used to their full extent that they could be, so that we benefit it from an institutional perspective?
Right, and a good example here at UMBC of that is when the social work program was looking for a tool to use, and they went to the Department of Education and took a look at TK20, and then they decided, well, it's really expensive, but we can get external funding. We could actually use this tool to help us understand how well students are learning. So when we took inventory at UMBC, we found that we already had tools for analytics, for example, Rex and Civitas that we mentioned earlier. And we found we had some tools for outcomes. So we had Blackboard and Blackboard Outcomes. Blackboard Outcomes kind of does a secondary evaluation tool, so we added in EAC to help us with that. We had clickers, we had Qualtrics, we had a number of different tools that we were using. But we found out that we had trouble linking learning analytics data to student learning outcomes data. So we created a discussion group to explore that. And those of you who are here from UMBC, you'll recall the bridging sessions that we've had, that we've been sharing at our symposium, and then again throughout the programming for the FDC. So we have a discussion group kind of working on those ideas. How do we bridge analytics and outcomes? We also found out that we needed tools to align direct measures to outcomes, and then also to aggregate rubric and test data. You would think Blackboard would be able to do that, but it cannot without the building block called EAC visual data, which we've been using in a limited way. It doesn't solve all of our problems, but it is sort of a step towards where we need to go in connecting these data. So we needed tools to align curricular and co-curricular learning. So we're using card swipe technology, and this really grew out of our student affairs assessment folks, where they're really trying to connect the idea that student engagement really does matter and is really important in student learning. So they're using card swipe technology to track student engagement across UMBC activities. And some specific programs will use the card swipe technology. For example, music. In the music department, students do need to go and participate in all kinds of events across campus. So they're using the card swipe technology to track that interaction and then bring it back into the program to analyze how well students are learning.
Yeah, and I see Brittany Brown is on remotely. She's here at UMBC. She works in our Student Affairs office, and she's really leading a lot of that work to capture that co-curricular data.
Right, and provide a tool for faculty and staff to use to figure out, how does student engagement in co-curricular activities impact their learning in the classrooms, right? So next part of our process is to identify audiences. As Sherry pointed out earlier, there are tons of audiences out there that want to know about our student learning, and we want to anticipate the kinds of questions that they're going to ask. So as you review the evidence you need, the ways you need to share it, and the tools already in place, it's going to become clear to you that there are multiple potential audiences. And in fact, I would argue there are audiences that we're not reaching yet, like, for example, our students. We may well want to share with students. I think if I were a student coming into an institution now, I'd want to know is, how is taking this particular program, say Sarah Bass's program in chemistry, how is taking chemistry going to help shape my learning, enable me to be a lifelong learner, help me to be able to apply my learning to multiple places in my future? And so when we think about audiences, I want to encourage you to think about students. And this is a part of communicating what it is that students are learning and how well that's working in your programs and across your institution. Of course, we have external accreditors, and a lot of assessment is driven by the fact that external accreditors and stakeholders want to know about that. Of course, we have the system in the state. We have faculty. Faculty are often gathering the data and analyzing it at the course level, but they're also going to want to know, how does this work out at the program level? Deans and chairs are natural folks who want to know, how well is my program contributing, or my college contributing to learning across the institution?
Right, and the core staff includes those advisors and student affairs professionals who would be interested in the data.
Right, because if we really had a strong understanding of how well students are learning, if we could use, the advisors can use that to help shape students' course plans, help them to find places where they can get additional support and things like that. And of course, the provosts and VPs and the board of directors, they want to really have a good view at the top of how well our institution is achieving its mission and serving the vision, and then also helping students to achieve all of the student learning outcomes at the institutional level. Our institutional research folks also help us to gather data, but they're also asking specific questions and using the data themselves. And then staff like Sherry and I, we're audiences, but we're also folks interested in gathering and using that data and finding out how it works. So some of the questions that your audience might ask as you're sharing your results and your access, these are a few questions that you might be thinking about. How can you make it accessible? And this is not providing CSV files that they can cut and paste and figure it out. It's actually giving them some type of a dashboard where they could ask a question. How well are my students learning scientific reasoning across all of the courses in chemistry, for example? You want to think about how you're going to present your results through the website. And if you don't have anything on your website about student learning, it's probably time to think about getting that out there. NILOA has a transparency framework that you can use to work through that so that you can share that information in a way that's responsible and helpful. We mentioned here double loop analysis, which may not be a term folks are aware of. We all know about closing the loop. We need to use the data to improve student learning. Double loop analysis enables us to examine how those closing the loop interventions have worked, whether they've been effective or not. And ultimately, what we want to do is share results and access so that we can think about ways to inspire creativity and motivation. And what we found is if faculty and staff and other folks get the data that they need to answer the questions that they have, that they can then move forward in new ways, and they're creative and inspiring in ways that we are not even anticipating. So by sharing these results and the access, it can really make a difference in how we move forward with assessment and how we make it more authentic. So next we want to talk about seeking expert advice. Who on your campus handles instructional technology and learning analytics? So at UMBC, it is actually Sherry and me. And then we have other folks in institutional research who share results. We have folks like Brittany Brown in Student Affairs who helps us to pull data from student engagement. And so it really is, we have pockets of experts all around campus. So whether it's staff people, whether it's deans and chairs, or whether it's going to the faculty and saying, you know, what did your clicker data tell you? What did your Scantron data tell you? What kinds of information were you able to pull out of these student learning experiences? So we want you to be thinking about who can help you, what expert opinions are out there, what data has already been used out there, what tools are folks using to dig into the data. And many of these experts will be on your campus. And since we're connecting at the system level, we've now extended our expert advice out to multiple institutions. So we thank you for participating in that. Our final step in our process is to form a collaborative team. We want multiple perspectives to help us to evaluate these technologies. We also want multiple perspectives to think about the ways that we can use the technologies more effectively to dig in better to student success. So we encourage you to form a team. And as part of this process, you have to identify the requirements for the tools, outline the gaps and the capabilities of your current tool set. Typically, you want to conduct some type of a market survey with your team to figure out what tools are missing. And if possible, contact folks who are using those tools and find out more information about them. And then we would work with the vendor to pilot the tools in your own environment and see if it actually works for the folks that need it.
Okay, so we're going to take a short break. We invite you to, if there are any questions that have popped up in this first hour, to post those in the chat. We can address them before we start the next session, but we're literally going to give you about a 4-minute break to take a powder break, get something to drink, stretch your legs, and then we'll start back up with evaluating assessment technologies. And for your listening pleasure, a little bit of Journey. Or yes, jumping jacks, that's good too.
Take it. All right, that's enough echoing. Oh dear. People aren't muted.
Back here in the next minute, so hopefully folks are back. Sorry about that echo there, just trying to wake you up.
If you're just joining us, or just to remind you what we've done so far, we've already looked at our taxonomy, our first tool. We've looked at our planning process for preparing for assessment technologies, and then our final tool, our third tool, is a rubric. And it's adaptable, and it's intended for you to customize it to your own needs at your institution. And we're hoping that you're going to share some ideas with us for how to make it better. So we've assessed and refined it by analyzing criteria for effective assessment and education technologies developed by other sources, and then we've triangulated criteria from multiple points of view to try to provide you with a flexible tool that you can adapt to your institution. And since the assessment process is ongoing, we're optimistic that the evaluation tool that we're offering here is going to continue to grow and change as assessment continues to grow and change. So the first area that we looked at is usability. Is the software easy to use? Will the users need lots of training? How well does it work with what we already have? Are we going to require additional steps? I mean, is it going to make more work for us, or is it actually going to make it less work? And I really emphasize the idea about whether it makes assessment feel like an add-on, because that is one of the objections to assessment for many folks. We want it to feel like the assessment part is embedded in our teaching and learning process. And then, of course, this also deals with whether it's interoperable. So LTI is something I learned from working with Cheryl on this project, and that is learning tools interoperable. Can one learning tool speak to another learning tool?
Right.
And then finally, we want to be thinking about accessibility. How accessible is it to people with different needs and different abilities?
Right, and as you begin procurement processes, accessibility, regardless if it's an assessment tool or some other type of tool, should be in your checklist of things to check.
The second criterion we looked at is functionality. First of all, does it reflect best practices in assessment? Because as we know, some assessment tools are really using old models of assessment, secondary evaluation, where you take it out of the hands of the faculty. What we really want is authentic assessment practices where the assessment is in the hands, the direct measures are in the hands of the faculty or the subject matter experts who actually know that area very well. We want to know, can it manage multiple levels of assessment? So you may recall the vertical alignment diagrams that we showed earlier. Can it pull these data up reliably and help us to understand how well students are learning? Will it help out users to actually create the outcome, to create and align the outcomes? We mentioned using EAC visual data here at UMBC. It's not exactly easy to use. People can't just click and match. It needs a sort of a system administrator to walk them through. We want to move away from that and let people work on these tools on their own and do what it is that they need. We also want tools that are going to help us with curriculum mapping and rubric development. Most of the vendors that we've gone around to look at, they say, oh yes, we've got the curriculum mapping, but then when we look at it, it's not as intuitive and useful in the way that we're actually thinking. Does it help people to think about collaborating across their curriculum? They usually do not. And then finally, does it offer easy to use reports and dashboards? Tools that we can customize to specific needs, because we know faculty in the classroom are going to have different questions than the deans and the chairs. They're going to have different questions than we would have at the system level. So we want to have dashboards and reports that we can use in multiple levels and across the institution. Our third area is costs. Obviously, we're all very concerned with how much it costs, and not just the annual software license, but what happens when there are updates. How much is it going to cost us to support the software and then also train people to use it? And what are the hidden costs? What costs might emerge out of using the software over time? And how can we manage those as an institution? So we want you to think carefully about costs. And then additionally, we're on audiences again, where we want to think about who needs to use, oops, sorry, it's okay. We're looking at audiences, who needs to use the software, how are they going to learn to use it, what are their questions, and can they answer their questions with those tools? And then additionally, we want to think about flexibility. We want software where we can splice, dice, connect, aggregate, reaggregate, disaggregate, and really connect data from multiple systems. Is the software flexible enough to meet your needs? Is it going to grow with your institution? And then really important, we don't really know what the future of assessment holds. We don't know what kinds of ideas are going to develop as we collaborate together and try to improve learning assessment at our institutions. We want a system that's going to adapt with us, that's going to grow and change and meet the demands that we haven't anticipated yet. And I know that's a tall order, but we at least want the vendors to be thinking about this and providing these ideas for us. So here are a couple of examples that came from our audiences at various presentations where we've talked about this. We are hoping that you could use Worksheet C and think for a little while about additional criteria. Security and privacy are always an issue, so some folks shared that. We are also questions about customization. How can you take this tool and customize it to your assessment plan, to your specific institutional assessment needs? And then another idea that came out of our audiences in the past is faculty, staff, and leadership buy-in. How can we get folks to actually use the tool? So even here at UMBC, we're using Blackboard, we sometimes have difficulty getting folks to use the Blackboard tool. We want them to buy into it and use that tool so that we can pull that data out and get it into Rex. So here we have Worksheet. If you look in your packet, you have Worksheet C, and this is actually Worksheet C where we started to fill it in a little bit. We're hoping you can work with your colleagues at your institution and think about what criteria, what did we forget in this rubric? What are we forgetting to include in terms of criteria? And what questions would you add about those criteria? So we'll give you a few minutes to work with your group or work independently to come up with a few ideas to identify additional criteria and additional questions to consider.
Open up and share. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and share. And I see that Valerie, thank you, Valerie, has given us, and Valerie is working with us here at UMBC this year. She is in an executive leadership program, and she's participating today. So it's good to see her online. And she says, I would love to see tools that give students an ability to capture their progress, also other than just viewing their grades. Also, how well tools integrate with other tools already being used is important, and how easy it is to get updates installed with little to no service interruption.
Oh, that sounds fabulous.
So those are great.
So this comes back, thank you, Valerie. This kind of comes back to our emphasis on the students as an audience for assessment data. Because if you were able to go into your learning management system or go into your portal and see how well you were doing in meeting the learning outcomes for each course, for each program, and you could see where you were strong and where you were weak, it would give you some additional way, and also it could also show you where there are interventions available for you. So if you found out that in taking, say Sarah's chemistry class, if you found out that you were really struggling with your ability to use quantitative reasoning, then you would know that you could go to the Learning Resources Center and get some tutoring in that area, or you could go and speak to your professor. But we're all looking for ways to motivate students and to help them self-actualize. If we could use assessment technologies to help students to really see how well they're doing and where their gaps in learning are, we could seriously help them to move forward and self-actualize.
That's excellent. I think we have one in the room here that we'd like to share with our poor audience in the room. This is the last time we'll ask you to share anything today, Sarah.
Until next week. Until next week, right. Okay, this is Sarah Bass from our chemistry department sharing.
So one of the things that I thought about is like one of the questions or criteria I would love to see are opportunities for collaboration. So not just across the institution, but even between institutions. That would be something that would be really helpful depending on the type of class and how large it is for scale and stuff.
That's great.
That's great. And you're really kind of on the cutting edge with this comment, because what we see across the nation is just a few pockets, like the multi-state collaborative using the value rubrics, where they're using the value rubrics in specific situations and then pulling that data up across multiple institutions so that we can really see where it is the students are learning and where they're struggling, and a broader view.
Yeah, here's a general comment from the chat, and I think it's actually representative of something we hear a lot with regard to lots of different things we're trying to implement on campus. How can we provide faculty with the time they need to learn the tool and implement it in addition to everything else they're doing?
Right. And time is always a factor, and that's why we need these tools to work a little bit more effectively and required a little bit less learning time. In other words, we want them to be more intuitive. We want faculty to be able to say, oh, if I click here, I get these data, and it's very clear. We actually would like it to be very straightforward and simple. When we presented this at the Drexel Assessment Conference, folks told us stories about how they splice dice, and it takes days and days and days just to pull together basic data, and that's frustrating. We want it to be streamlined, we want it to be effective and simplified so that you can get the information you need with very, very little time.
So those are the last comments that I see in the chat. Are there any others that would like to share before we move on?
Okay, great. So next up, we're going to give you your charge for next week, because we're going to continue next week, and we have some homework for you. So Sherry, you want to tell them what we want them to do?
We do. On the second worksheet, you started to work on your institution's taxonomy. We want you to take the time and to really, as an institution, I know there are multiple schools that have numerous people participating in the webinar. We'd like for you all to get together and really try to fill out that taxonomy as completely as you can. So that would be the first tool that we provided. Then we want you to actually go through and use the Planning for Assessment Technologies approach that we provided. Right, Jennifer?
And so we would encourage you to use that vertical alignment worksheet and become just familiar with that idea about how you take evidence at the assignment level and roll it all the way up to the mission. So we encourage you to use that worksheet. It's also on the FDC or Faculty Development Center website that Sherry gave you the link for. So in terms of that planning assessment technologies process, we'd like you to spend some time on clarifying your common grounds. And if you're able to think about the direct evidence you need in the backward design piece, we'd like you to do that. We encourage you to take inventory. Figure out what tools are already being used on your institution, and then once you gather that information on the worksheet, you'll be able to see some gaps. And if you go back to the slides where we looked at some of the UMBC gaps, obviously we still have gaps that we're struggling with, and we anticipate that we'll still be struggling with those, but we want you to think about where your gaps are. And then think about your audiences. Who on campus are your experts? Where can you get expert advice? And then who would you have on the team? We're hoping some of the folks in the room with you, some of your colleagues that you're collaborating with to do this work would be part of your team.
Right, and so for your clarifying common ground, I know that each school has at least 1 or 2 faculty that are participating. Identify one of those faculty's courses maybe and try to do the exercise of clarifying common ground with that.
Exactly, especially if they're using a rubric or a test where they can sort of map it right back up to the course program and institutional outcomes.
Right, and then if you have some ideas for how we can improve the evaluating technology tools, that checklist, you want to share those via your worksheet that we provided there as well for next week. So we really are going to expect the different institutions that are participating today to report out to us next week. And really what we hope is that at the end of that call, we can talk about how the system can help. You will have had a chance to look at where your gaps are with regard to assessment, whether it's tools or being able to pull data together. But how can we take advantage of our systemness once we've all taken a closer look and a deeper dive into what we've got on campus and how we're using it? We want to make sure that in the end, not only are we getting better at this from each institution's perspective, but at a systems perspective. And so we want to be able to go back and tell Nancy and MJ and the crew, this is what we need you to do to help us to be more effective when it comes to assessment.
Right. So we would like you to complete some of those worksheets, and then if at all possible, you could send them to us via email so that we can put them up on the screen, because we really want to dig in and figure out where are we having these gaps, what types of tools are being used across the USM institutions, and then as Sherry said, so that we can give MJ some things to think about.
Absolutely. So if you could, as different institutions, try to complete these worksheets by in a day, Wednesday, early Thursday morning, to give Jennifer and myself a chance to take a look at what you've got so we can kind of pull some things together to share with you. And we will ask each institution to report out next week. So you guys got to be pretty passive today, but we are going to hope to hear people report out and to tell us what they found with regards to systems, gaps, things they know they need help with, all that kind of things. We really want this to be a sharing session next week where everybody can benefit from hearing what others are doing.
Does anybody have any questions?
Questions in the chat? Questions on the mic? Great. And so Nancy's saying she'll send out a reminder about this to everyone who registered for the webinar. We'll restate the homework assignments, and we will make sure that everybody knows what's expected next week and really what we're trying to get out of it. And we're going to give you almost 20 minutes back of your Friday morning. So if there aren't any questions, we're going to sign off and thank you all for participating. We'll sit and see if there are any questions that come across.
And those of you from UMBC, you're not off the hook, because we do want to challenge you to do this homework assignment as well. And think about what are the tools and technologies that we've forgotten about, the audiences that we may not have included, and you can build on the slide that we presented earlier.
We're getting a comment that says this would make a fantastic presentation or workshop for OLC Innovate, and the call closes on the 26th. Jennifer.
Oh, how funny. We did submit, and we were accepted to OLC Accelerate.
No, Innovate.
Oh,
they're talking about doing another workshop in Innovate. But we are doing a presentation at EDUCAUSE in October, at the end of October, and we're doing a presentation around this at OLC Accelerate in Orlando in November.
But we put in proposals for the other.
We did put in a proposal for the other OLC. So if you want to go to Denver, isn't that one in Denver? Hopefully it'll come through, right? Hopefully, we'll see. But we will be in Denver in October and Orlando with Mickey in November.
And then next year, we're really hoping to do some proposals and presentations where we pull this up to the system level, show the systemness.
Right. It would be great if we do make some progress, and that way we can get some other institutions to present with us on how things have improved and progressed as a result of this work. So that's kind of where we're going, we see in the future. But we thank you for participating. As Becky Brzezinski says, we'll see you next Friday.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Have a great weekend.